So is Michigan a community property state? And more importantly, how is property divided in a divorce case? So we're not a community property state. There are actually most states that are not anymore in the sense of that. Community property would mean I'm married, whether I'm married 6 months or 10 years, everything somehow all automatically gets divided equally no matter what, regardless of whose name's on it or where it's from. So community property would be sort of this harsh idea that everything is split 50-50 no matter what. That's not the concept in Michigan. Michigan doesn't do that. So Michigan is what you would call a dual property state, first of all. So we split property into two different categories. When you're dividing things in a divorce case, you're looking at two different categories, which is why it's called dual property, dual as in two. So there's marital property and there's separate property. So then marital property would be what you would normally think of, things that you would acquire as a married couple. You've been married for a long time. You bought a house while you were married. You used, money, just joint money, and just kind of regular sorts of things happened, and you bought the house together, and the house is marital property. Meaning you get divorced, and the house is half hers and half yours. Half belongs to your wife, half belongs to you. So then that's marital property, is this idea that whatever you acquired during the marriage is going to be divided equally, whether it's a house, retirement accounts, savings, investments, whatever it might be. You own a business, all those things could fall into the category of marital property. So then the second category is separate property. Separate property can be something you own before the marriage. So separate property could include premarital property, and it can also include gifts or inheritance, although gifts is a little lesser of a category typically, but inheritance is a typical one. So separate property would be something that's considered separate when you're dividing property and you're dividing what you would call the marital estate. So you're dividing things you acquired together. So you would divide the marital property. The presumption is that's going to pretty much be divided equally. But then there's separate property that potentially you would keep all of in a divorce. If it's your separate property, you would potentially be keeping 100% of it and not owe your wife any of it. So separate property might be you've been married for 10 years, 15 years, doesn't matter how long, and you inherit some money from your family member. Your parents die, leave you some money, and they leave it to you in your name. You inherit that property, and you then keep it separate in your separate name. And now you're getting divorced 5 years later, let's say. That separate property, that inheritance, can be something that's yours, and you don't necessarily owe any of it to your spouse in a divorce case. So Michigan is a dual property state. They look at marital property, they look at separate property. Separate property, an example, could also be something you own prior to the marriage. Even if there's not a prenuptial agreement, you could still get into a situation where, let's say you're getting married a little later in life and you own a house from before the marriage. Or, let's say you get a rental property that you own, and then you get married, 5 years later you're getting divorced, you still own the rental property, it's still just in your name, and you really haven't put any money into it, it's just the normal kind of stuff. And now that property there's a question in your divorce case of what happens to that rental property. Well, under Michigan law, you could basically claim it as separate property and not have to share it with your spouse. There would be no claim on their part that somehow this real estate that they had nothing to do with and you owned before the marriage, now you're getting divorced and you're dividing things up, you still own that real estate. You could say, well, that was separate property, I get to keep that. And that would basically be reasonable. That would be considered equitable under our property division laws. And you might be able to look at things like what kind of money did you put into it while you were married. That could be a factor where your spouse might have a claim for some of that. But in general, separate property, if it's been kept separate, can be claimed as something you don't have to share with your spouse in the division of property in a divorce case. So Michigan, not a community property state. A lot of states are not community property states. We do really equitable division of property, and we do equitable division of marital property. So you're first looking at two categories: what's marital, what's separate, and then the marital stuff is to be divided equally, and you look at sort of how that makes sense. Equitable meaning usually you're just divided equally. There's not a lot of reason for one person to get more than 50% of the share of marital assets, like savings from during the marriage, a house from during the marriage, retirement accounts, those sorts of things from during a marriage. So then the question becomes what assets are subject to division in a divorce? Well, pretty much anything you can imagine that has any sort of value is divisible in a divorce case if you acquired those things during the marriage. So if you're a business owner, we had a client recently who's a business owner, and his wife was actually part of the business. She owned 10% of the stock in this business that he had started. She owned 10%. He owned like 40%, let's say, and then there were some other shareholders. Well, in the divorce case, his wife owns half of this 50% share because he owns 40%, wife owns 10%. Well, according to Michigan property law and division of property, this business that he had started during the marriage was half hers, half his. It didn't matter what the stock ownership said. But the property that's going to be divisible in a divorce case is anything and everything that has value. A business, a house, a rental property, investments, savings, retirement accounts. Retirement accounts are always in only one person's name. You're not going to have an IRA or a 401k joint with your wife. But in a divorce case, they're still divisible. Your 401k is something she has a claim to half of, and hers is something you have a claim to half of. So that's how that's going to work. So then there's also this concept of commingled property. So what does that mean? So commingled would be something that's kind of in between these two categories. You have marital property, you have separate property, but then you might have something that's kind of a combination of the two. For example, you have a house, let's say you had a rental property that you owned before you got married, or even just the house you live in. You have a marital house you owned before you got married. You get married, you've owned it for 10 years, now you're married, you and your wife are living there for another 5 years, and then you get divorced. Well, that might be considered commingled because you've paid money into it. Houses are nothing but sucking money out of you, right? I mean, that's how home ownership goes. So you definitely put money into it while you were married. Even just paying the mortgage, paying the taxes and so those sorts of things can make it kind of commingled because you're paying for it during the marriage with your money or your wife's money or both, doesn't matter because you're married. Or you might have, let's say you did a remodeling project on the house during the marriage. So you owned it long before you got married, but now you're married, and then you put 20 grand into updating a bathroom or a kitchen or something. Well, that 20 grand is then makes it more commingled. You've put marital money into that house that was a premarital property. So that's the concept of commingled, is when you're taking property that was separate, like something you owned before the marriage or an inheritance, and now you're combining it with money from during the marriage. You paid bills on it, you did a remodeling thing on it, you did some updates, did some investing. That creates, causes it to be commingled. So that's the idea here of, are we a community property state? If not, then how does it work? It's equitable division, but it's really dual property, and then dual property is marital or premarital or separate. And then the marital property category is divided equitably, but the separate property category isn't. So that's sort of the general idea and a little bit of an overview on what does this community property stuff mean versus dual property and equitable division. And that's kind of what those concepts are that are floating around out there. So hopefully that helps. Thanks.